Jesus, I would say no doubt lived as a person, but to the extent of what he did, I'm not sure.
If he comes walking into where I work, shows me the signs of the stigmata and tells me he's the Son of God, I might start believing.
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in an age of science.
I have a lot of different thoughts and theories on Jesus, but I don't think coming back from the dead is really possible.
I just thought the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving creator of the universe was just an absurd idea on the surface of it. It wasn't even worth my time to check out. As far as Jesus was concerned, I thought that if he existed, and I wasn't sure whether or not he ever did, he was probably a nice guy, he was probably an excellent teacher, but he certainly wasn't the Messiah, and he certainly wasn't the Son of God. Now, my wife was more in spiritual neutral. She was more of an agnostic, whereas I was more antagonistic toward Christians.
I just didn't know where all the pieces fit together. I didn't know who Jesus was or how he fit into the picture. Lee was antagonistic towards God. I was simply confused.
There really was no room for God in my relationship with Leslie when we were dating and when we got married, but you know what? We were happy. We didn't have any problem with that.
When I first started going to church, Lee responded very negatively. He basically told me that this is not what he had signed up for. That when we had gotten married, he had life planned in a way that did not involve church.
My biggest fear with Leslie was that she was going to turn into some religious prude or something, and I thought nothing good can possibly come out of this. But even though I had all these negative ideas of things that were going to happen, in the ensuing months I began to see positive changes in her character and in her values and the way she related to me and the children. And it was winsome and it was attractive. And so when she invited me to go to church with her on January the 20th of 1980, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go. Get her out of this cult, that she's gotten involved in.
He did go in with his reporter's notebook so he could take notes and try to find a scandal.
Well, the pastor gave a talk that day called Basic Christianity, and he just systematically laid out what it is that Christians believe. And my mind was blown because I had all these misconceptions, and he really did straighten me out on a lot of things. And I remember walking out that day saying two things. First of all, I was still an atheist. He didn't convince me that day that God exists. But secondly, I realized if this is true, this has huge implications for my life.
Lee's approach was very different from mine. Mine was mostly a heart issue. I wanted to know that God was real, and the way that was real for me was experientially. And for Lee, it was more about documentation, about being able to have facts that proved it true.
Well, I was a journalist, so there was really no problem with me picking up the phone and calling a scholar and saying, hey, I'm Lee Strobel, I'm with the Chicago Tribune. I'd like some background information about the New Testament. And so I would do that, and I thought it was going to be so easy to expose the fallacious thinking behind Christianity. But as it turned out, it took me almost 2 years of my life to investigate these issues. It really was, in a sense, the most exciting story I'd ever pursued as a journalist.
I think, unfortunately, because the documents, the New Testament and specifically, were written so far after Jesus' death, that it's really hard to say.
I don't know myself that it was real. I was not there, but people were there at that time. So their account of things that happened back 2,000 years ago has been passed down.
As an attorney, I rely on evidence. And so, it would be tough to get evidence at this late date.
Well, I began my investigation by looking at the gospel accounts. How did I know that the New Testament was telling me the truth when it talked about Jesus? Now, obviously, I didn't accept the New Testament as being the inspired Word of God. I certainly didn't accept it as being inerrant. But what I had to accept it as being, which it undeniably is a set of ancient historical documents. And I knew that historians had criteria that they could apply to determine whether or not these documents are trustworthy. So those are the kind of people who I pursued. I went after the heavy hitters. I went after the expert witnesses who could help me sort through these issues.
J.P. Moreland, Biola University. Mark Strauss, Bethel Seminary. Craig Blomberg, Denver Seminary. Craig Evans, Acadia Divinity College. N.T. Wright, Bishop of Durham, United Kingdom.
Over the last 250 years, it's been common coin in Western culture that, you can't believe what's said in the Gospels. It's even made into musicals. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. And that skepticism has wormed its way into much modern culture, and indeed into many Christian circles, many church circles, where they'll say, well, Matthew probably made this bit up, or Luke just added this bit on the end of the parable, or whatever it is. I and others have spent some of the best years of our lives researching what was actually going on in Palestine in the first third of the first century AD, and trying to get inside the minds of first century Jews, first century Romans, different Jewish parties and movements, etc., etc. And the more that I have tried to do that, the more I've found that what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John comes up in 3 dimensions and says, my goodness, this actually belongs. It makes sense. It fits. It gives us very vivid portraits of who these people were and what they were doing.
The New Testament Gospels are biographies of Jesus. While the authors do not identify themselves in the text, from very early in the Christian era, the Gospels have been attributed to Matthew, a disciple or follower of Jesus, Mark, a colleague of Peter, also a disciple, Luke, a historian and confidant of the Apostle Paul, and John, a disciple of Jesus. Both Matthew and John were among the 12, Jesus' closest followers, and constant companions throughout his ministry. They would have personally observed most of the events they described in their Gospels. Mark and Luke were also contemporaries of Jesus and wrote their biographies based upon information provided by many eyewitnesses.
I knew from my years as a legal journalist the importance of eyewitness testimony. In fact, the first question that anybody asks is, how many eyeballs are there? How many eyewitnesses do you actually have? And I needed to determine whether or not contemporary scholars have ascertained whether or not the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony.
It's become evident to scholars of the first century that the Gospels were actually attempts to write biographies of Jesus. Now, not in the modern sense, because the Gospels are not particularly interested in his early years. But when it comes to Jesus' adult life and his activities, these are biographies. They're very clearly attempts by eyewitnesses to describe exactly what Jesus said and did, and the consensus of New Testament scholarship has moved in that direction.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2.
Luke's Gospel begins with a prologue. It's actually one of the finest Greek sections in the whole New Testament. Luke was clearly a literary artist. But in that prologue, he points out that he has carefully investigated the material that he presents in the Gospels, that he's checked with eyewitness accounts, those who are actually present. If you read that prologue and you see this is the work of a historian, this was someone who has done his research.
Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you,